There were exceptions to people who didn't know how to read the Bible at all. Not that this person is the example of the best theologian around, but Erasmus. We've talked about Erasmus before. Erasmus of Rotterdam lived from 1466 to 1536. He was an Augustinian monk who was the illegitimate child of a priest. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. Some people argue the greatest Greek scholar of all time, but for sure of his age. He did not approve of, he saw the need for reform because he saw how corrupt the church was, but he didn't see the answer as theological and doctrinal as much as he saw the answer as being clean up the exterior, whitewash the outsides of the tombs, to hearken to Jesus' teaching. He opposed Luther's biblical view that the human will is in bondage to the sin. He opposed Luther on a lot of things, even though they are both considered by the world as people part of the Reformation. 1524, Erasmus wrote a book called Free Will, which was the natural conclusion of a humanistic high view of man. The shifting of society's worldview from God-centered to man-centered was not a positive development. It was a positive development to shift away from the church in place of God. And people say we got to get away from the church, the Roman church, controlling every aspect of society, often in a very corrupt manner, a very sinful manner. But we don't want to whisk God out the door, and that's kind of what was happening in a lot of this. We are, as I said, still experiencing the negative results of man-centered, or we should maybe say self-centered worldview in our society today, and it's not positive. It is not a step in the right direction. How could a man-centered worldview be the prelude to such a great spiritual awakening, you might be asking? And if you're not, you should be. The reason is that the God-centered worldview that was prevalent before the Renaissance was not a God-centered worldview, really. It was a papacy-centered view. Because remember, there had been several popes that said, I'm here in the place of God. What I say is truth. I cannot err. Salvation includes obedience to the papacy. All of these things, of course, are wrong. And so God used that. The shift to a man-centered worldview, although not God-honoring, was used by God in His providence to break the stranglehold the Roman Church had on so many for so long. So we say one of the big shifts during the Renaissance that led to and set the stage, so to speak, for the Reformation was out of the medieval was the cultural shift of the Renaissance. And then next we would say another thing that was happening in society was a political shift of nationalism. A political shift of nationalism. And very simply, what's going on here is that you got to understand, during the medieval period, many people never traveled more than 15 miles from where they were born. I mean, a big traveler, maybe 50 miles from where he was born. Everybody is very localized, small cities. There were some big cities, but most people lived in small outlying areas. And the leaders of these little areas just had a small authority. But all of these, all over Europe, were under the umbrella of the authority of the papacy. And what happened and we've already talked a little bit about it. We see little pre-rumblings of this throughout the latter half of the medieval period, but now it's really starting to pick up steam, is that these areas are becoming nationalities. England obviously becomes a nation of its own. It's on an island. The Irish and the English and the Scottish, they're completely separate. A lot of good things happened there. William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066. He established the feudal system. The body of representative leaders in 1215 brought about the Magna Carta. And I wish we had time to go into that, because there's a lot of thinking here that even those who signed that, they signed that because they were afraid not because they believed in it. But that's another story. The Magna Carta is the document that is really the landmark document of modern representative government, limited rulership by laws. Laws, see, because when you're in the feudal period, the kings, and then to a lesser degree the lords, they're not subject to the laws. They make the laws, and they use the laws against the lower class in order for them to maintain power. But what's beginning to happen here is law is becoming king, that even the leaders are subject to law. Now, you and I might look at that and say, well, yeah, of course, isn't that true? It wasn't then. And folks, again, we have many leaders in our world today who are Machiavellian and who say, I'm above the law. I'm allowed to do wrong for the sake of what is right, which is, of course, a terrible, terrible thing. Even the people had the right to determine how much they'd be taxed, which is a totally new concept. Of course, today, the Machiavellian leaders convince the people, no, vote for a tax on him and we'll give his money to you. And, you know, so people can always figure out how to do wrong. In 1295, King Edward I established a model parliament made up of representatives of the country. This is really the first place that this is taking place, jolly old England. And the parliament's made up of the House of Lords. Those are landowners and people who are part of the church. And there's the House of Commons, made up of like the lower house, made up of the commoners. And those two, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, kind of is projected into here, with the Senate being the higher house and then the House of Representatives being the lower house. During the 14th century, this is the 1300s, the Parliament received legislative powers, essentially granting them power over the king. These are huge shifts. And listen, this has a lot to do with what happens with the Reformation, because people were emboldened to say, you know what? Who says the Pope is right about everything? You have no idea what a huge deal it was. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but for Martin Luther to stand before the representatives of the church, archbishops, bishops, etc., to say, councils err and the Pope errs, but the Scripture does not err. You can't say that about the Pope? Well, I just did. You know, might have been his thought, even though he probably didn't say that. King Henry II, this is also in England, 1133 to 1189, was instrumental in establishing common law and a jury system. You didn't just have some king or some prince listening to the case and pronouncing. No, you had a jury of your peers. Again, we're so used to this for the last umpteen years that we don't realize how groundbreaking this was and what a foundation this set for the church to say, wait a minute. What's been going on for so long isn't biblical. It isn't right. England warred with France from 1337 to 1453 in what has come to be called the 100 Years' War, because that's kind of 100 years. It wasn't literally 100 years. This gave England and France strong nationalistic identities. Why were the English and the French fighting? Well, because the English and the French, they've never really been that close. You know, they've had some marriages and what have you to try to bring them together. But the English and the French, they're not real chummy. And neither are they today. Not only does England develop into a nation, France develops into a nation. Spain develops into a nation largely because they got a national identity because they were being overrun by the Moors, the North African Muslims who were coming across the channel and invading and indeed taking over taking over Spain for a long time. We see there was a couple of factions in Spain, and they married to unify, and that helped them become one nation. Germany already had a national identity, and I say this with all fun and jest, but with a little twinkle of truth. The Germans have always been trying to conquer the world. And but now, I mean, they've had power. The Holy Roman Empire, remember we've talked about that, was basically led by the Germanic, the Teutonic people in northern Europe, which really becomes Germany. Meanwhile, a word about the Eastern Church. Now, we've talked about the Western Church mostly because that's really what we're more about, and because the Western Church has influenced the world more than the Eastern Church. But the Greek Orthodox Church from 1305 to 1517, not as much was happening there. They've always kind of been in a little bit of a time bubble over there. In 1237, the Russian branch of the Orthodox Church was cut off from Constantinople because Russia was invaded by the Mongolians. A lot of people don't realize this is just secular history. The Mongolians, more Asian people, they ruled Russia for a long time. And by 1480, the Mongolians were completely in control of all civil affairs in Russia, being cut off from Constantinople politically and also just because of distance, not to mention the weather. The Russian Church, who was a part of the Eastern Orthodox bloc, they kind of became their own Russian Orthodox as distinct and separate from the Greek Orthodox, which is the Greek Orthodox is kind of like the godfather, if you will, of all of the Orthodox churches. Not so much, well, sort of. Let's just put it that way. Sort of. We haven't got time to go into a great deal of detail about that, other than that by 1589, the Russian church was a national church. Still a part of the Eastern Orthodox way of thinking, but separate from the Greek. Constantinople fell to the Turkish or Muslim hands in 1453. This weakened the Greek Orthodox Church, making the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow stronger. The Russians broke away because of their political issues, but then when the Muslims took over Constantinople and Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, the Greek Orthodox Church all of a sudden becomes very suppressed. Although the Renaissance had an effect on the whole world, its greatest effect was on Europe and the Western wing of Christianity, because the Reformation was a Reformation aimed at the Roman Church, not so much as the Greek Orthodox. So some people ask me, well, aren't the Greek Orthodox, aren't they a part of the Reformation? No. They're really more like what the Roman Church was before the Reformation. The East changed very little because of the Renaissance, and again, it's just a cultural thing that was happening. Why do we take the time for this? There's a lot of things happening in the world that are not necessarily spiritual, some of them not even necessarily good. But God used all of these things as a springboard to say, okay, the world is now going to see the Reformation. And that's what we'll go to next.